So this is a story based on a story I once heard, and as such things go, I've adapted it slightly from my own telling, just as you will adapt it when you tell it yourself. There's a Jewish tradition of putting special bread, baked with great care, into the ark under the Torah scrolls in the synagogue as an offering for God on the Sabbath. So a rabbi was preaching to his congregation about this beautiful tradition one Sabbath, and a faithful woman heard this, and she decided to bake the special challah, which is that braided bread that you see and some of you like to make or eat. And by the way, you're never supposed to slice challah bread. You're supposed to tear it. She decided to bake it herself, even though the custom had gone out of practice, and she thought she'd bring it to the synagogue. Well, her bread was perfect. It was fragrant. She covered it with a cloth very carefully and placed it in the appointed place when she was sure no one would see her on Friday morning. And she spoke some prayers as she did so, hoping that her offering would be pleasing to God. The custodian of the synagogue, whose job it was to check that the Torah scroll was rolled to the proper place for the reading the next morning, opened the ark and was surprised to see a package having been placed neatly inside it. Well, he opened it, and there were 2 fine-looking challah loaves. He had no idea where they'd come from, but he thought perhaps they were baked by angels of the Most High. You never know. And he decided to honor God's gift and take them home and eat them with great gratitude and appreciation for God's abundance. After all, he thought, this bread is meant to be eaten. That evening in the service, the woman waited impatiently for the end of the prayers, and when everyone had left the synagogue, she approached the ark in great trepidation, and she swung open its doors to see that the loaves were not there. She was thrilled, and she hurried home to share this joy with her family. She said, God has not disdained my humble efforts, and God has accepted the loaves I have baked and eaten them while they were still warm. Therefore, she said, every week we must try to give God this pleasure with the same care and devotion that we did the first time. Her children helped her bake the challah each Friday morning, sifting the flour 13 times, and every Friday afternoon she would sneak into the synagogue and pray over them and pray that God would accept her gift and leave them there. And every Friday, the caretaker would come along and happily eat the delicious challah loaves. Every Friday night, every Saturday night, the woman and her family would rejoice once again. Their meager offering had been accepted. And so this went on for many weeks and months. Well, one Friday, the rabbi of the synagogue stayed much later than usual until the afternoon, and he stood on the bima, the reading platform, reviewing his sermon for the next day, when to his surprise he saw one of his congregants enter, carrying 2 loaves of challah, walk up to the ark, and deposit them inside. He realized that the woman was unaware of his presence, and he heard her utter her fervent prayers for God to accept her offering and to enjoy the challah. The rabbi listened in astonishment. Well, at that moment, or soon after that time, after the woman left, the caretaker entered the synagogue, expecting to pick up his challah bread as usual. He was a bit startled to see the rabbi standing there watching the departing back of the woman, and she turned, hearing the noise, and there was a very awkward silence. The rabbi beckoned her over as the caretaker stood there with his bread, her bread, God's bread. And the rabbi gently said, would you like to tell this woman what you're doing? And the caretaker explained, well, I've been collecting this wonderful bread for months now. And he was so happy about it, but the woman burst into tears because she was crushed. It wasn't an angel of God at all who had taken her offering, but the shamash, the caretaker, a mere mortal. She was humiliated. And the caretaker was also pretty mortified because he had thought that the bread was an offering from the angels, from God. The rabbi said to the woman, "Your offering of bread, given from the depths of your heart with joy and with awe, does indeed go directly into the heart of God, the Most High." And then he turned to the shamash. Is it shamash or shamash, or anyway, the caretaker? And he said, "Because you have received this offering of bread with joy and awe and gratitude, so do you too partake of God's holiness whenever you eat it. For God has commanded us to do mitzvahs, or good deeds, and is always present in these acts. Neither of you has cause to be humiliated or upset. Neither of you has misunderstood the situation at all. In the baking of the bread and the offering of it and in the eating of it, all is holy." And so the woman and the caretaker continued in this ritual of gratitude and love for many years. And they and their families understood this to be a special bond between them, and they all broke bread together many happy times around a common table. I love this story because of that moment of embarrassment when the woman and the caretaker are looking at each other, and after all of this time believing they were interacting directly with God or with angels, they realize, oh heavens, it's just you. What a shock. I thought I was interacting directly with God, but it was just you. But of course, when it's just us, we are interacting directly with God. It's for each of us to decide, as we move through the world, brushing up or banging up against each other, are we going to think of these human interactions as obligation, as irritation, as opportunities, or as holy blessings? Sometimes I think about what I call church time, the amount of time it takes for us to get some things done. Things take a long time usually, like our Lynn partnership. This congregation has been thinking about it and talking about it and researching it for 30 years plus. And that's a long time, but that's church time. One reason things take a long time in the church world is that those who are making the decisions, which is all of you, are volunteers, are come together voluntarily out of a calling of your heart and soul. And you have lives and full-time jobs in many cases, and families, and all different schedules and availability. The realest reason that things take so long in church time is also that relationships and process matter just as much as outcomes. It isn't just the bread we're after, in other words, that final product. It's also the baking itself, the attentiveness, the deep listening, the devotion that goes into that baking of the bread. That's what we're doing. In the story, the rabbi tells the woman, or tells the congregation, that in order to bake this ritual bread, one must be in a state of ritual purity, which takes a lot of time. It's internal work. It's also external work, community, relationships. He tells the congregation that the flour must be sifted 13 times and baked in an oven that is just the right temperature. This is a metaphor for the care with which we are all meant to do things that matter in our lives. And we practice that care as a congregation. That's actually our highest mission. Here we unlearn haste and mindlessness and competitiveness and the instinct to rush past each other, rush past moments, pull that golden thread that Julian told about in his story to get to the next milestone or the next diversion. and we learn to be really present to life, which means being truly present to one another. Only then do we recognize that what we are living is sacred. As ordinary as it may look, the pouring of the coffee, the wearing of the name tag, the call to someone who is hurting. That level of attentiveness is the essence of reverence. As we gather in our pledges for our budget for the 2018-19 program year, it isn't just the things we can do with money that matter. It's not just the outcomes. Those are very important, absolutely, but what matters just as much is that we do what we do in community, in consultation, in deep listening, in the spirit of discernment. What matters just as much as outcomes are the relationships that we build along the way among ourselves and our partner organizations. Our outcomes can seem to take a very long time, and if you've ever been on a committee, you know that. If we're going strictly by goals and a crossed-off to-do list. But along the way, there is life itself that we cannot miss and must pay close and reverent attention to. There are conversations that must be had, wherein we support one another in the wide variety of challenges we face. Support, compassion, understanding. We must stop to express these and to experience these so that we are not merely existing but living. Along the way to meeting goals, there are also formal and informal reasons to celebrate. So we're called to do that too. There are children born to us and young lives that take us down paths that only they can show us, and we must follow. There is the wider community in our nation and the world whose pain and need we also, God help us, try to respond to and weave into our concerns. Along the way, there are prayers we must offer. Prayers of thanks, prayers for wisdom, the opening of the soul to humility, where we may encounter the voice of God within and through one another. This is also our appropriate business, just as surely is any item on any agenda. We measure our success then not so much by goals met as by love shared, which means stopping to listen deeply, to pay attention, to knead the dough 13 times, to wrap our humble offerings of self carefully in our most beautiful cloth before sharing it with others. Sometimes we are the bakers of the bread. Sometimes we are the ones eating it with gratitude. The gifts are given and received in grace.